Okay, so let's talk about the brain. Okay, so we got the two hemispheres of the brain. I'm just holding on to the left hemisphere right now, but so we've got the longitudinal fissure and then we got the transverse fissure. Longitudinal fissure divides between the left and the right hemispheres, and then the transverse fissure between the cerebrum and cerebellum. We've got the folds of the brain, those are called the gyri, and then the grooves in between are called the sulci. We've got several regions of the brain. We've got the cerebrum, we've got the midbrain, the diencephalon and brainstem. So here you see here, this is called the, right above here, this is called the central gyri. And so this big large one's called the central gyri. We've got the corpus callosum, which means white body, right? So the function of the corpus callosum is to connect the left and right hemisphere. This thing right here, this is called the fornix, right? And this is called the lateral what? Lateral ventricles, right? So this thing right here, this is called the oval window, right? So that you see there. Here's the intermediate mass of the thalamus. This is the...
Is that hypo? Or?
So hypothalamus would be down here.
Hyper?
So it's this pink thing here.
Oh.
That's the pineal gland. That's the pineal gland. Okay, so we got the hyperthalamus, thalamus, hypothalamus, right? So hyper means above, hypo means below, okay? What is the function of the thalamus?
Temperature regulation.
That would be the hypothalamus. So the thalamus is the central relay station. So all incoming sensory information except for
smell, right?
Smell first goes to the thalamus, and then from the thalamus it goes to the appropriate association area in the brain, which we'll get into next week in lecture.
Is the thalamus that whole bulbular thing or just that small spot?
Pretty much this spot, this whole area right here is the thalamus.
What's that spot that's on there?
So this is called the intermediate mass of the thalamus. Okay. And then the hypothalamus is kind of like our thermostat. So this is where we're regulating like thirst, hunger. It's also where we find like sex drive, all sorts of other kinds of things like that. You find a lot of that in there, okay? And then we've got the pons and the medulla oblongata. So here is the pons, right? So that's the Latin word for bridge. And then we've got the medulla oblongata. Both the pons and the medulla oblongata primarily regulate respiration and heart. Right? So there's the pontine respiratory center, and then there is the medullary respiratory center. So one regulates rate, and the other regulates depth. And then there's also for cardiac centers in the pons and the medulla oblongata. So for example, you're experiencing hypoapnea, right? So you've got not enough carbon dioxide in the blood. This will tell your pons and your medulla oblongata to decrease ventilatory rate so that you start to rebuild. And if you have hypo, right, meaning you don't have hypocapnia, meaning you don't have enough carbon or too much, or your carbon dioxide levels too low, or hyper, meaning you have too much, right, you'll start hyperventilating, right? So we'll talk more about that when we get into like the digestive system, but that regulates that. And then we got the cerebellum, which means little brain. You got the arbor vitae that is in there. So the function of the cerebellum is to do what again, guys?
Coordination, balance.
Helps regulate coordination. So the cerebellum really, what it does, it works in combination with the motor cortex to like smooth out muscular action, so it's not spastic and jerky and things like that. And then over here we've got the pituitary gland, and this little stalk here is called the infundibulum.
Can you move your finger?
Yeah, so this is called the infundibulum, and then there's the pituitary gland. So the pituitary gland is kind of the master control gland for the endocrine system. It works in close regulation with the thalamus and the hypothalamus. You got receptors in your brain. So receptors in your brains say that receptors for estrogen are empty, right? Meaning your estrogen levels are low. Sends a signal to the thalamus, which then sends a signal to the hypothalamus, which then sends a signal to pituitary, which then sends a signal to your ovaries for ladies and adrenal glands for men to upregulate estrogen production. Estrogen receptors start to fill. What happens? Signal then goes to the brain that all of the estrogen receptors are occupied. Thalamus then tells the hypothalamus, which tells the pituitary gland, which tells the appropriate effector gland to downregulate production of estrogen. So that's how that biofeedback loop that we use to regulate most of our stuff. So signal comes into the thalamus, right, for everything, and then goes to the appropriate association area in the brain. right? So everything comes in through there. We got the gyratory, we got the sulci in between. I think that's really about it. Do you guys have any questions about some of the structures or anything like that? No? All right, there you go.
Thank you.
You're welcome.